Welcome to the third workshop of the research group, Conditions of Sovereignty. I have some announcement before starting this forum. We are still waiting Wang Sensei, and due to some problems, he will be a bit late. And so before starting his conference, I propose to discuss what? I propose to have some conversation each other within this research group. ですね、皆さんこんにちは。お越しいただきありがとうございます。ちょっとですね、ワン先生が事情があって少し遅れるということでして、ゆっくりお待ちしながらですね、ワン先生をここで少しお話をしてお待ちしようというふうに思っております。こういうね、オンラインでやって、今までソウルとアメリカをつないでやりましたけど、そんなすごいことをやっていて、ぴったり時間が始まるというのも、本当はおかしなことであってですね、これぐらいのことは普通だと思いますね。この回もちょうど3回目になりまして、3回目になりますので、少しお話をしていきながらね、始めたいと思います。For those who have just come to the conference, we are still waiting for one sensei. So before starting the conference, I propose to have some conversation and to present this research project. I am my name is Koichiro Kokubun. I'm the leader of this research group founded in University of Tokyo, and this research group aims at reconstructing, deconstructing the concept of sovereignty. And if you have some knowledge about the contemporary philosophy, for example, the philosophy of Jacques Derrida, for example, the concept of sovereignty is really problematic, right? Maybe I think the contemporary philosophers do not simply believe in the validity of this concept, which is in a sense very old, and which is in a sense very modern. So we do not believe in the validity of this concept, but however, the problem I would like to think is that certainly this concept is very problematic. But however, we are now faced with the, I say, demand made by people for sovereignty, or claim made by people for a sovereignty. For example, we know what happened in the US with Donald Trump, or we know what happened in the UK, which is called Brexit. sovereignty is problematic, but in this contemporary world, there is a sort of demand for sovereignty. So what should we do with this situation? And especially, I am a scholar based on Japan. Japan has a really serious problem with sovereignty, I think. For example, in Okinawa, we have big US big military bases, and the Japanese government, in Okinawa, there is a very strong movement against this military base, but the Japanese government is always with the US side. And we recently, I think in the past 10 years, the Japanese people are now noticing or wondering if the Japanese people have sovereignty. We have been always under the control of that big state, the United States, and maybe the sovereignty, of course, in the Constitution of Japan, there is a description of what the sovereignty is, but we are wondering now if we have really sovereignty, and if we are sovereign. So I think the task is double. To notice the necessity of sovereignty, and at the same time deconstruct. I use this very useful word, deconstruct. Deconstruct the concept of sovereignty. So this is the third workshop, and in the first workshop we invited Professor Jack Lesler from the US, and the last time we invited Professor Kim Han, and so we want to think about this very problematic concept, notion, through the various regional situation and regional philosophy, thought, etc. And today we have invited Professor Wang Sensei, and he will talk about maybe the modernity and the China, right? So this is a very, very general presentation of this workshop. Maybe Wang-san.
Yes.
Wang Sensei.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Okay.
There's no problem. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for this. Yeah. So should I start?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
I'm the leader of this research group. My name is Koichiro Kokun. Very nice to meet you. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Okay. Okay.
So, maybe take your time. Maybe your friend Ishii Sensei present a little bit.
Okay. Okay.
And I'll let you
okay.
And
okay.
Take a breath.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
You do not have to worry.
Okay.
じゃあちょうどワン先生いらっしゃって、本当に良かったです。良かったです。ありがとうございます。じゃあ、僕がちょっと下手な英語でいろんな話してましたけれども、じゃあ石井先生、
で始めますかね。
始めますかね。よろしくお願いします。
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for thank you very much everyone for coming this workshop. Already, Professor Kokubun has already introduced our workshop entitled "Condition of Sovereignty." This is the third workshop for us today, and we are very much delighted to invite Professor Wang Hui from Tsinghua University. And I personally also very much delighted to be here to introduce Professor Wang Hui to everyone in UTokyo and audience, maybe from all over the world. Yeah. And first of all, I want to say that, yeah, Professor Wang Hui, please come back again to University of Tokyo again, although this is online, but we are very happy to meet you again. And yeah, our conference, today's conference is now, we are recording it. So Professor Wang, could you mind if we make it public after the conference on our website?
No problem.
No problem. Okay, thank you very much. Because some students asked me to watch the video because of absence today. So this conference, this lecture by you is now already got many audiences in University of Tokyo. So it is very it is very happy for us. Yes. Okay. I will make a brief introduction of Professor Wang Hui, who is from Tsinghua University, and I believe he is the most distinguished intellectuals in contemporary China. His works were already translated into Japanese. I will copy the names of the Japanese publication in the chat function. We've already had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 works translated in Japanese. So yeah, thank you very much. This is Professor Wang's masterpiece, The Rise of Modern Chinese Thought. It's Japanese version. It's not the whole version of the original book, but the I participated in the translation of this book, so it is also my honor. And for English translation, he's already have two books, 2 translations. Yeah, you can see the chat function. And I hear from my friend that his masterpiece, The Rise of Modern Chinese Thought, is now under translation into English. So maybe hopefully we can read the book in English as well. And today's topic is entitled The Birth of the Century, China and the Condition of Spatial Revolution. I think this is his latest research project, or is now ongoing research project. And I guess this is related to his latest book published in China last year, entitled 世纪的诞生, The Birth of the Century. I copy the name and the chat function as well. Yeah, 世纪的诞生, I published in 2020, maybe one year ago. So this is his latest interest about the China's condition, especially in the 20th century condition in China. And his significance of his thought, I think, is that he connected the China's politics toward the world. He has a very strong theoretical background using its political theory. He's criticizing the China's revolution history, and through doing so, he raised many significant critiques against the politics in the world. So he managed to connect the China situation to the political condition in the current world. So his works are very important for us, not only for researching China, but also for those who are interested in today's political condition in the universal sense. Okay, this is my messy introduction about Professor Wang. So yes, please, Professor Wang, start your talk today, and
okay,
audience, please give applause.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? It's fine.
Yes, I think very clear.
Okay, thank you, Professor Tsuyoshi Ishii, and also colleagues here. And I'm very happy to be back to Tokyo University, though it's online. Hopefully, we can make it to the real visit in near future. As Professor Tsuyoshi Ishii said, that this talk was really related to my latest book. It's The Birth of a Century, and it's talk about China. And I already sent you a paper, which is the second part of my long introduction. And I could only focus on one part of that, the political displacement, because our forum here is a discussion here with a focus on the sovereignty issue. That's why it selected a part of that was there. But before I talk about that, I just want to mention 2 points. One is that the idea of time, that the century, the concept of the century emerged in China only at the beginning of the 20th century or end of the 19th century. So changed the whole conceptual framework of time for China, integrated into the whole universal time. But that was together with the new idea of the space. So the spatial revolution was a very important event at that time for China. The second point is that the 20th century for me, especially for China, not only for China, was started from a series of revolutions. That revolutions happened not in the center of the capitalist world, not in the center of the Europe. It's like the French and the British and the French revolutions, but happened in peripheral areas. So the Russian, China, and also as well Persia, Turkey, and some others. So that I think we can locate the position of China in the global history. So that's and also when we talk about the issue of sovereignty, nation state, and so on and so forth, we need to think about its relation to these historical developments, not only from the normative idea of sovereignty and the state. So that's my basic points. And in his 18th Bromel of Louis Bonaparte, Karl Marx examined the relations between the political action and the historical premise within the framework of history and the repetition, viewing new content within an old form through the lens of repetition. Unlike the prospects that Marx has charted out for Europe's revolution and the counter-revolutions of the 18th and the 19th centuries, those of 20th century occurred within a special revolution. In other words, they took place within the synchronized temporal relations of the century's multiple temporalities. As such, their politics of repetition and displacement typically produce the topics or subjects of horizontal temporal relations. Just like the European 19th century transformation problems of the old and the new, old, Asian, and the modern always hovered in the space of 20th century politics. Yet, these contradictions between the old and the new were situated within the conflicts that erupted between the multiple temporalities. So it has therefore become impossible to separate them from their horizontal temporal relations. Given that these horizontal relations are temporal in addition to being spatial, they constitute a process of connecting different axes of the temporalities together. Thus, the narration of history is not only the moment from past to present, but also when moving from there to here, from here to there. So it's a transoceanic relations also happened. So, or the moments between the various spaces. Relations to the origins are mostly horizontal, even those of exchange and circulation. As a result, although 20th century politics often resorted to conditions of opposition or accord between the Asian and the modern or East and the West, such coordinates were in actuality extremely simplistic articulation of the relations between the multiple temporalities, all of which were embodied within a new shared temporality. The concept of the imperialism centers on economic analysis. However, unlike analysis of the process of production and circulation in the 19th century political economy, this concept was by necessity also focused from its very inception on global relations and imperial competition. How then did politics unfold within such a discourse? It would be nearly impossible to present the politics of the 20th century and its historical implications while leaving aside the century's own series of entirely new concepts and categories. So, but at the same time, if we take these concepts that had already been translated or retranslated from the translations of other languages and pose them as the structures or basic categories for our view of history, then extremely clear disjunctures come into focus between the discursive system and the actual social conditions. In this epoch, notions such as individual, citizen, state, nation, class, people, party, sovereignty, society, the culture, and so on and so forth became core concepts for new politics. Production, means of production, social formation, and other associated ideas became the basic category with which to describe China and other societies. The propositions such as the weakest link, relations between ourselves and the enemy, border region, intermediate zone, three worlds, united front, and so on, were all born from the assessments and the strategic or tactical thinking about both international and national circumstances under the conditions of imperialism. Of the terminology for the major concepts, categories, and propositions mentioned above, with the exception of an extremely small number produced within concrete struggles, such as a border region, intermediate zone, virtually all come from translations and appropriations of 19th century European ideas and propositions. Sometimes it's with the mediation from Japan. So wherever 20th century revolutionaries and reformers made quick use of these concepts, categories, and the propositions for concrete political practice, they have become a source of endless consternation among the recent generation of historians. For example, a number of scholars have heaped ridicule upon the misuse of the word feudal, for example, in modern China. They bend over backwards in order to accurately delineate these words' European origins, while expounding on China's use of concept as having misconstrued its original meaning, consequently leading China's modern politics astray. If the category of feudal has been thoroughly misused, then what would be the basis upon which to characterize China's former and subsequent social formations? In addition, while 19th century European capitalism and colonialism were being established, the socialists invented the concept of the proletarian, which was seen as accurate the representation of the future revolutionary subject. In 20th century China, the search for proletarian to serve as a revolutionary subject was a sustained political process. Yet in this barely industrialized society, the number of workers, their scope, and organizational level were all extremely feeble, such that it has been called into doubt whether the capitalists of China could even constitute a class. I mean, in the first half of the century. Now the situation is radically transformed. But does this also mean that China's revolution was itself a product of misunderstanding? So that's posed the question. Dipesh Chakrabarty has found that in India and other parts of the non-Western world, efforts to seek out a revolutionary subject have produced a whole series of replacements for the social category of the proletarian in Western industry, including peasants, masses, subalterns, and so on and so forth. But the phenomena of repetition and displacement occurred not only within a category like a proletarian, they can also occur within all of the categories indicated here. So the revolution and the counter-revolution also embody this logic of displacement. These categories do not have an explanation which could be offered with simple reference to 19th century logic, nor do they have one which could be presented purely in accordance with their etymology. Numerous categories and the subjects of China's 20th century were all repetitions, almost, from 19th century Europe, and some were early 20th century Europe. But with each repetition also came a displacement that was not only the product of the different context, but also functioned as a politicizing form of displacement. As such, these concepts restructured historical narratives while also breaking with the previous narrative's hegemony, thereby laying the path for the development of the new politics. This is by no means to suggest that the discursive practices of this era were free from errors in concepts and categories, but rather to say that without analysis of the process by which these concepts and categories were politically deployed, we absolutely cannot understand their true implications, force, or the limitations. Consequently, we would also be unable to make use of them in order to comprehend 20th century China's distinctive qualities. The 20th century's abundance of horizontal relationships was the product of the Spatial Revolution. As explained above, the birth of the century signified great changes in multiple temporalities, transforming them into the moments of the unevenness within a shared temporality and bringing forth an absolute demand to view history from a horizontal axis. The horizontal movement of concepts as well as their uses among different historical temporalities is indeed the most striking feature of the 20th century. In fact, this transformation on temporal synchronization takes the Spatial Revolution as its condition. Under the premise of the Spatial Revolution, temporally oriented the relationships between increasingly horizontal. the great transformations of the modernity, as well as the discourses used in describing them, cannot be narrated via a diachronically related guiding thread. Rather, their account must be derived from their multiple temporalities. When I describe these phenomena as the horizontal moment of concepts, these formulations' utility lies in articulating how, within a synchronic framework, historical content from the different temporal axes was transformed into that which could be expressed in a single discourse. In other words, what is described above as a displacement or the process of producing a new politics can only be understood within the horizontal temporal relations created by spatial revolution. Whenever these alien concepts are used under the historical conditions totally distinct from the conditions that originally produced them, then the new consciousness, values, and moments are born. So taking stock of this mode of production, Marx anticipated this special revolution saying, he said, quote, "The bourgeois has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country." Here, I will analyze the significance of the special revolution that burst forth in relation between the multiple temporalities by focusing on the transformations in both state, form, and the connotation of sovereignty. From Marx's perspective, the special revolution originates from the constantly revolutionizing the whole relations of society that capitalist production relies on. This is a constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation. It has drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which it stood, forging new relations between city and country, the new national and regional relationships. From this process, which centralized the means of production, here is very important that which centralized the means of production, there emerged a process of political centralization. So this is a political centralization. Sovereign state is a political form, was the result of the centralized means of the production. So independent but loosely connected provinces with separate interests, laws, governments, and the system of taxation became lumped together into one nation with one government, one code of laws, and one national class interest, one frontier, and one custom tariff. That's Marx and Engels in 1848. Marx didn't analyze the diverse compromises in political form and the social arrangements that were produced in order to accommodate differences among historical conditions, but ever between the most flexible social systems that the process described above, relations endured that were difficult to discard. With respect to China was political centralization, the prolongation of the lengthy historical tradition, or was it a new form demanded by relations of production or exchange? The sole correct response to these questions would examine these phenomena by situating it within the horizontal relations of multiple temporalities. For this reason, no matter whether it is a method of impact response or a logic of so-called internal developments, neither of these would hardly be adequate to explain China's revolution and its tortuous process, to say nothing of accounting for the special conditions necessary for the continuity, so-called continuity of the sovereignty and other domains. Unlike Marx, who investigated the special revolution and the political centralization is a unified sovereign state from the perspective of capitalist reproduction, Carl Schmitt worked within a general outline of the European history, tracing the origins of the spatial revolution back to the context over colonizing and developing new territories during the 16th century's age of maritime exploration, maritime hegemony, and territorial occupation, as well as their political forms, became the key content of these competitions. Yet, as regards the formation of the fundamental order, these were not only contests between the hegemonic states, but were also rivalries between two kinds of order, each with profoundly different religious and cultural backgrounds. In other words, this competition was invested with the significance of historical turning point because it was far more than a mere dispute over interests. It was also a struggle for Carl Schmitt between the two grand camps, namely Catholics and the Protestants, centering on the discovery of new territories and a type of order suited to the establishment of colonies. And given the prerequisite, the conditions that this struggle focused on the territorial occupation and its political forms, it was a type of combat undertaken far from home, in which one could only advance by traveling overseas. Consequently, later generations launched, I quote here, launched the first effective attack on global hegemony and the maritime monopoly of their forerunners, transforming the sectarian civil wars into a new conviction of a kind of so-called supreme political authority. So as seen from Schmitt's perspective, the struggle between the European countries was therefore motivated not by the distinction between the new and old imperialisms, as described by Hobson and Lenin, but rather by that of the Catholicism and the Protestantism, which made a way for a new kind of political subject to take the stage. It was precisely this struggle that, for him, neutralized the theological religious conflicts, making life secular and turning even the church into a state institution. Under these conditions, the concepts of the state and the sovereign first attained authority of juridical form in France. Consequently, the sovereign state called particular form of administration began to enter European consciousness. For the imaginations of the peoples in the centuries to come, the state became the sole standard political unit of expression. As a result, for Europeans, these marked the start of an epoch of nations, spanning the next 400 years of history and demarcating the modern world's whole scope and orientations. In this era, spanning from the 16th to 20th century, the state governed all the conception of political order. So, however, while the formation of a state as a cogent political body had not yet occurred in 16th century Europe, China's own epoch of the state emerged more than 2,000 years ago, as early as the Qing dynasty, even earlier. So in the late 19th century, the Qing court was still unfamiliar with the notion of sovereign countries that stemmed from a long process of internal sectarian wars. China's Confucian thinkers expressed the world order using the formulation, the so-called 列国之士, the authority of many states, a transparent appeal to the competitive political model of Zhou dynasty. That was, it's 1,100 to the 221 BCE, that as early as that, as a means for understanding the contemporaneous world situation, as well as distinguishing it from the principal system of dynastic unity that had been in place since the Qin and Han dynasty. From the perspective of the forms of production, during the epoch of Europe's rule by force as well as its control of regions in Asia, there existed in these territories different kinds of the state formations. For example, China, of course, Japan, the Ottoman Empire, Safavids, the Mongol, and so on, all were empires. Japan was a little different, primarily based on the agriculture, while Kiowa, Hormuz, Calicut, Malacca were relatively small coastal states founded on commerce. That Sanjay Subramanian's work was already demonstrated this very well. This manner of distinguishing state topologies has a distinct epoch, the echo in Schmidt's discussion of the land and the sea. As for China, the formation of the rational bureaucratic system, so-called the Junxian, of Qing dynasty, as well as its evolution as a state formation, constitutes a major chapter in China's history. In a cultural realm, this system integrated Confucianism and legalism. Political authority was intensely concentrated. Political forms submitted to a high level of bureaucratization. The integration of former feudal division into the system of the so-called prefecture and the counties impacted the relations with regional communities. In terms of internal-external relations, the formidable appearance of dynastic system provided a basic framework for a large unified state. In order to accommodate the change and the crisis, both foreign and domestic, modern China's revolution and the transformations couldn't but seek aid from all sorts of foreign powers, forms, and value systems. But historian Philip Kuhn countered the character, he said, I quote, the character of China's modern state has been shaped decisively by the flow of its internal history. Political activists of the 19th century were already dealing with the questions of the participation, competition, and the control in the context of conditions inherited from the 18th century and earlier. So when the people discuss the birth of China's modern centralized administrative system within a sequence of the historical continuity, how do they explain this spatial revolution? This revolution was pushed along by the Maritime epoch, as well as a system of centralized authority, signaling the arrival of the modern states in France, in England, and the Sicily, or what Marx, in other terms, held as a political centralization, urged in by the concentration of the capitalist production. Beginning with the Opium Wars, Europe's imperial powers sought to impose their conception of order on China and its neighboring regions, where they ruled over all. Furthermore, they wielded the logic of international law as a means of managing and bestowing names upon each distinct political entity. Under these conditions, the concrete historical unit of organization, which had formerly been pure, bound to its own epoch, delimited by history, lost its historical position and the substantive features in the bewildering process of abstraction. This form of state was transplanted to various contexts belonging to fundamentally different epochs and peoples. It was held into the midst of altogether different outcomes and organizations. That's Carl Schmitt's quote here. From within a new synchronic temporality, how do we explain these historical patterns that were both distinct from one another and yet bear the resemblances in both form and function, identified today as phenomena of national sovereignty? First, this specific type of state system was constituted as a consequence of the imperialist expansion. So merely pointing out that the state is a form of domination is not adequate. It's only a normative idea. One must also point out these systems' various transitional forms, the different transitional forms on behalf of the sovereign state. So finance capital and its corresponding international policies gave rise to a number of transitional forms of the state dependence. Not only are the two main groups of countries, those owning colonies and the colonies themselves, but also the diverse forms of the dependent countries, which politically are formally independent, but in fact are enmeshed in the net of the financial and the diplomatic dependence typical of this epoch. Among these, I quote actually the paragraph was quoted from Lenin. Among them, China, Turkey, and other semi-colonies were one type, while Argentina, Portuguese, and so on constitute another, characterized by the form of financial diplomatic independence, accompanied by the political independence. It's interesting. Portugal had a colony in China in the late 19th century, Macau. However, Portugal could be thought as a semi-colonial, or it's not real sovereign, was the only semi one. So that also the transitional forms of that, we should pay attention to these. Secondly, after having experienced a series of cultural revolutions in 20th century, people begin using a sort of universal method to designate the various communities found throughout the history as the ancient, medieval, or the modern states, while the polities like China and others not included in the Western history were pejoratively termed empires, dynasties, tribes, or the tribal states. Up to now, still the people use these in the Western media. The sovereign state was established by way of omitting the difference from the course of history, or by suppressing the various forms of the historic time. As a result, these not only required a so-called homogeneous, empty time, but also a conception of synchronicity in which the relations of multiple temporalities could be contained. Let's now examine the interconnected relations of internal historic evolution and external historic evolution amid the changing interactions of the land and the sea. From 17th century onward, the Qing dynasty came into contact with what Schmidt has termed the two different kinds of the hunters who participated in the vast expansion of space, which means that the Russian pursuing the pelts and the pirates from northwestern Europe. In 1636, Hong Taiji established Mongol Yamen, which temporarily managed the administration of Mongolia. 3 years later, it became the Li Fanyue, a bureau governing the Mongolia, Odisha, Tibet, and the southwestern Tusi, as well as managing the institutions of the Russian affairs. So no such clear demarcation between so-called domestic affairs, international affairs. Here was a more complicated, ambiguous domain. However, the Treaty of Nyerchinsk, concluded in 1689 between the Qing and the Russian government, clearly shows the accord reached between the sovereign state throughout the entirety of the contents, the scientific delimitation of borders, recognition of administrative jurisdiction in the border region, control over residents crossing the border from each side, accommodations for the foreign residents, and the wenpiao, a kind of the passport, and entry admittance for the commercial activity, as well as the treaties composition and the translation into different languages. The formal text was in Latin and attached by the Russian texts, and the Manchu later became Han Chinese, the Mandarin. So it's interesting because even at that time, the so-called sovereignty issue, these kind of the treaty between the sovereign states in this form was real, even in Europe. So what's come here? Why? The Kangxi Emperor selected two Jesuits, the French missionary Jean-François Guibelin and the Portuguese missionary Thomas Pereira to join the party representing the Qing dynasty in negotiations. And also they used the technology to decide the borders from the Europe, that the European technology. Not only did they serve as the translators, but they also assumed the role of the advisors. So they were versed in, at that time, because they were in Europe, that was the age of competition between the Britain, France, and the Portuguese, and especially Spanish forces. So that's why they're versed in the theories of the Hugo Grotius as well as European international law. And these represent the new force of the rise of the in the 17th century, that the whole land. This document was thus a sovereign treaty between two sovereign states. It's strange because it's difficult to use this term to describe the Russian Empire and the Qing dynasty as a sovereign state, but the treaty itself was in the form. It's interesting, in the 1960s, after the publication, it's a publicized debate between Soviet Union and China. What the consensus between the historians in Soviet Union and China was that the Neo-Qing Treaty was a sovereign treaty. Despite the different other differences, these are the consensus. So by the start of the 18th century, the Kangxi Emperor had already dispatched the Vice Minister of He Shou to establish a Bureau of the Affairs in Tibet. I mean, almost at the same time, different form of the centralization of the state. Here, the Neo-Qing Treaty only treated the regions in the border areas between Russia and China. But on the other side, the different form of the centralization happened in different conditions. Here, but at that time, the practice of having an embed in Tibet, that the Qing appointed imperial resident in Tibet, had not yet been implemented. In 1727, following the Qing's suppression of a Tibetan invasion by the Mongolian Zhangar tribe, the Yongzheng Emperor established the position of embed. In addition to being personally dispatched by the Qing Emperor, the embeds also shared the responsibility for the administrating Tibetan affairs with the Dalai Lama and the Bancha Lama. This system was continued until 1912, when the departure of the last embed from Tibet announced its conclusion. Subsequently, it was followed by the Tibetan Officer of Affairs and the Mongolian Tibetan Bureau of Affairs during the Republic of China, as well as the Tibet Autonomous Region in People's Republic of China. So you can see the change and following that in different ways. The evolution of the system in Xinjiang, for example, and Adihar paralleled the formation of that in Tibet. The Qing court implemented the Beg system for the Uyghur, Kyrgyz, Tajik communities in the region. Formerly, the Beg was the official position of the leadership among the Huihe population of northwest China, with records in the histories of even the Tang and the Song dynasties. In 1755-9, after suppressing the revolt of the Adishar Khojas, the Qing court reformed the back system by integrating it within the Qing bureaucratic structure. With the establishment of Xinjiang province in 1884, the Qing court abolished the various levels of back system, implementing a bureaucracy consistent with the rest of the Qing state in its place. This tendency toward the political centralization was an extension of the Qing state internal crisis. As early as Xinjiang's involvement in Tongzhi Huiluan, so-called, and the period of the Yakub Beg's invasion, the back system had actually already fallen into disuse. In its comparison to the transformation of the Xinjiang region, the reform and the realignment of the Tu-Si chieftain system in the southwest was implemented in the fourth year of the Yongzheng Emperor, the 1726. These policies implemented by Qing court official court of the Altai, long before the establishment of the Xinjiang province, had very little relation to any external forces of aggression. It's really from internal rebellion and the crisis. So the transformations in the state formation described above were distinct from the 19th century global conditions described by Karl Marx, because it's not only the centralization of the state, it was not only the result of the centralization of production, but a series of different crises here, internal, external. By no means was political centralization the consequence of having centralized the means of production for Marx. Rather, the tendency of the centralized political power was the result of complications in geopolitical relations between the peoples in the interior and the imperial court. From the 17th century onward, in Qing era studies of its territory, exists on the classical texts and the writings that address the political policy, we can clearly observe the Chinese court's political design for a vast land of multi-layered complexity in territorial undivided, but nevertheless containing diverse cultures. This was utterly unlike previous historical distinctions, including the new Confucian demarcation between the culturally distinct so-called Yi and the culturally domestic Xia, as well as internal and external delimitations of the regional bureaucracy, that the Jingxian. And of course, it was also distinct from the internal homogenization presented within the European nation states' political perspective. From this point of view, China could only produce an accord between the state's internal political order and the external world by organizing itself on the basis of a far-reaching set of relations based on the so-called ritual, different kind of tributary relations and the ritual relations and so on and so forth. This China was a product of the gradual historical changes, as well as its own incarnation of a ceaselessly changing history. Thus, what we call the geographical perspective by no means presents a simply geographical problems. Behind them is the problem how to define China in terms of both space and signification. From the start of 19th century, there was an intimate relationship between this tendency toward the internal centralization of authority and arrival of the second kind of the hunter, the pirates from the northwestern Europe. The cause of change in the Qing dynasty political system clearly attests to this point. This was no concentrated effort during the early years of Qing to attend to institutions managing foreign affairs. Instead, responsibility for such matters was delegated to the Bureau of the Reception, or one of the four courts, within the Ministry of Rights. The Ministry of Rights was established in the northern Zhou state during the northern and the southern dynasties with 6 ministries. First founded in Sui dynasty, subsequent dynasties continued to maintain this organization until the conclusion of the Second Opium War. In accordance with the first article of the 1858 Treaty of the Tianjin demanding an envoy stationed in Beijing, in 1861, the Qing court finally acted under the pressure from Britain, France, and other major European powers to establish the Zongli Yamen, or the office in charge of affairs of all nations, which assumed the responsibility for Ministry of Rights as well as the Li Fanyuan. These institutions, ranked above other 60 ministries, lasted for 40 years from 1861 until the 1901, when the 12th clause of the Boxer Protocol of 1901 designated the establishment of the Foreign Office. The Sino-European relations by no means began with Britain and France. Spain and Portugal interfered in affairs of Asia before the Northwestern European states. While is it then that it was only in the later half of the 19th century that the Qing dynasty was obliged to establish an institution dedicated to foreign relations, as well as reform its management of tributary relations and begin the practice of dispatching the foreign envoys. In addition to the contents of these treaties produced by the above incidents, what special significance lies in the differences between the Northwestern and the Southern European countries. In other words, differences in the sovereign states and their standardized relations, as they have been produced by struggles between the Protestant and the Catholics for understanding sovereign relations in China and the Eastern Asian region. Britain, the French Huguenots, and these because the French was the Catholic, but the Huguenots was minority by the Protestants, and the Netherlands, the last of which had arrived in the Northeastern Asia much earlier, stood at the front of line Protestant resistance to Catholic power. And their struggle with Spain's Catholic domination initiated the epoch of a new world order, with the maritime order its distinguishing feature. At this time, there was a competitive relationship between Britain and the Netherlands, but British theories of the international law and the attendant concepts of sovereignty were themselves derived from those of the Netherlands. So their mutual enemy was Spanish Catholicism. So that's why Kashmir said here lies a case unique in its essence. Its uniqueness, its incomparability consists in the fact that England completed the elementary transformation in a wholly other historical moment and in a manner fully different from any other sea power. So it's really displaced its existence away from the land and into the element of the sea. So it thereby won not only sea battles and wars, but also something wholly other, infinitely greater, namely a revolution, and indeed a revolution of the greatest kind, a planetary spatial revolution. That's Carl Schmitt's arguments. As for the pirates from Northwestern Europe, the era of the sea was the epoch in which the Atlantic, Indian, and the Pacific Oceans were all simultaneously transformed into the inland seas. Their institutional arrangements in this period were concerned with the consolidating control over the distribution and the construction of authority over the continents, as well as their associated relations of the interest. That in 1517, the Portuguese used military force to occupy and establish their authority through the camel trade settlement. But after successive failed attempts at the further military invasion, they withdrew in 1553. That's the 32nd year of the Jiaqing Emperor, to the territory of Macau. That's the long time. Then in 1572, they paid a land tax of the 500 silver pieces in order to acquire political and economic rights to Macau. Within the framework of the Ming Dynasty, law and administrative management of the maritime security, these constitute a tacit permission for the autonomous rule. The municipal council of the Macau was established in 1583, and from 1616, a governor was appointed. Portuguese lease on Macau was also a sign that the wave of great maritime epoch had reached China's shore, but it is generally believed that the transformation of Macau from a leased territory into a colony only occurred in the wake of Opium War. So before that, it's difficult to describe the Macau as a colony. So it's in that sense, the question of the Macau status as determined in previous relations between the Ming court and the Portuguese never touch on the subject of the formal sovereignty, even though its substantive content relates to the 19th century issues of sovereignty, a lot of the overlaps, but it's not not formal sovereignty. Rather, it was more bound up in the so-called problem of the Catholic Church's protectorate of missions, That was different from the sovereign relations. The state of the protectorate of the missions involved the Vatican's granting a sovereign state the authority to safeguard Catholic missionaries' right to proselytize in non-Catholic region. The matter of the protectorate of missions was directly related to the commercial problems as well as the issue of jurisdiction within a territory. But the principle among the contradictions and the conflicts inside it was the struggle it revealed between Eastern and Western forms of protocol. So in the distinction to the above circumstances, the major indicators of an age of maritime authority had arrived were British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, founded respectively in 1600 to 1602. These two Northwestern European companies bore at different levels characteristics of a state. It's a company, of course, however, functioned as certain way as a state, including the ability to levy taxes, conscript soldiers, erect fortifications, and so on and so forth. These companies, in their inception, development, transformations, and the closure were inextricably bound up with the formation of modern sovereignty. So once the Dutch East India Company had consolidated its commercial network in order to monopolize the China's silk export commerce, the Dutch planned to dispatch a naval fleet to force the Portuguese out of Macau and seize their base by force. After this plan was thwarted, the company persisted in its design to gain the foothold in China's developing liberal commerce, thus deciding to construct defense fortifications on the Penghu Islands. However, China's authority determined that the Penghu Island was China's territory, taking the company's action as an infringement upon their sovereignty and consequently taking firm action to cast out the Dutch. As early as in later Ming, the competition between the Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese in Macau, the Penghu Islands, Taiwan, and elsewhere has already given rise to disputes over so-called sovereignty. So you can see that it is also related to the confrontation and the competition between the Catholic and the Protestant in Europe. But these kind of cultural background, the religious background, to some extent disappeared in the East Asia. But here, the two powers competed each other. So during the 1820s, in a prelude to the coming Opium War, British India had already provided the training and the fine arms for Jahangir's military, strongly supporting the rebellion in Xinjiang. As a result of this crisis in region situated at the heart of the Asian continent, it became a key site of the contention for two major empires, Britain and Russia. As such, these conflicts find its distinct echo in the Crimea War of the 1750s. During the Crimea War, Russian foreign diplomat Nikolai Ignatieff received orders dispatching him to both Khanate of the Kokand and the Khanate of the Bukhara. In addition, he also was a signatory on the Treaty of October 11, 1858, which gained Russia the right to navigation on the Amur Darya. Following the Ignatieff's journey in the Central Asia, he was then hastened to China in order to mediate the Second Opium War. In this capacity, he successfully hoodwinked the Qing government into the signing the Sino-Russian Treaty of the Aigung, the Aihui, and the Convention of Beijing, making off with over 1 million li of territory, as well as winning of Russia the right to commercial trade in the Kashgar. So Engels' commentary demonstrated even more clearly the significance of the Crimean War for Asia. The Crimean War is far away from what Asia looks, but actually closely linked together. Engels said, the return match which Russia owed to France and England for her military defeats before Sevastopol has just come off. So with respect to these issues, Eastern question, Central Asian question, and the Far Eastern question metamorphosed into the world historical questions that could not be separated from one and another. It is in this sense that we can integrate the Opium War, what Mao Zedong called the starting point of modern China's history, into the transformation of the global order. This is particularly the case for grasping the process by which the two major Asian empires struggled to gain the geopolitical hegemony. By taking the age of the Opium War as our point of departure, we can understand the decades of 1820s to the 1860s as the constitution constituting a part of China within the global process that bound up with the arrival of his era was the beginning of the new imperialist epoch, whose distinguished characteristic was the rise of the United States, Germany, and Japan. So that's the second half of the 19th century.
Okay, Professor Wang.
It's almost finished.
Professor Wang.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Could you still stop in more 5 minutes or so?
Okay.
Okay.
I will.
Thank you.
Maybe 5 minutes. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. So I think this the whole change. Both are I try to talk about the different forms of the political side, the centralization, and together with different historical driving forces, which either the Marx or the Carl Schmitt cannot be simply, they will give me the inspiration for understand our history, the whole the history, but also we should look into the details of our own history. So in respective of who control this space, two kinds of order, the sea and both manifesting a clear tendency toward the political centralization, even before these phenomena had come to the fruition in terms of the perspective possible within Europe from the start of Dutch efforts in the early 17th century to attack and occupy both the Penghu Islands and after the later the change. So and maybe I would like to say something for the because the spatial revolution in the 20th century, as in the beginning, was from long 19th century. We talk about the so-called centralization, but 20th century, when we talk of the foreign, the sovereignty and related for the format of the state, it's difficult to not to mention the revolutions, different revolutions. So here I just mention here maybe the couple of minutes. From the perspective of spatial revolution, no matter whether it be incidents of general importance of Opium War, the Sino-Japanese War, China's 1911 revolution, the May 4th movement, the second Sino-Japanese War, or Japan's assault beginning in 1870 on the Liuqiu Islands, Taiwan territory, or Korea, all these can be seen as a maneuvers between the continental forces and the new maritimes. So that's what we can see the 19th century, long 19th century, the forms. But China's revolutionary project engaged with two different orders, broke them apart, reconstructed them, and adjusted them within a dynamic historical process. In this epoch, there existed not only a struggle between the forces of the coastal revolution and the inland conservative powers, but also assaults undertaken by inland radical forces upon their own traditions, having been catalyzed by the maritime powers. So that's, in that sense, we found that the wars, if we compare the 19th century wars and the 20th century wars, that the radical difference in between, partly because in the 20th century, the whole was to get linked together was the revolutions. That revolution, not only the resistance against the intervention from the outside, but also restructure the whole social structure of our own history. So that was, we talk about the new dominance or the new form of sovereignty without talking about the revolution and its results. It's difficult to understand the 20th century China. I stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Wang, for your very wonderful presentation. So yeah, we are now entering the discussion session. So firstly, I would like to ask our research members to raise some comments or questions. So Professor Nakajima, do you have a question? Yeah, please.
Yes, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. My question is very simple. How can you think of the relationship between revolution and sovereignty? In the last part of your presentation, you mentioned the new form of sovereignty would be appearing in the revolution, right? But revolution is also based upon some kind of sovereignty, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
what type of shift, transformation of sovereignty could be found in the revolutionary process, especially in China?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I collect the questions or directly answer.
Please answer now.
Okay, okay. I also give the very direct answers for these. The first for the in the 20th century, because the new state was the result of the long revolution, they based on the huge social mobilization. that the power centralized in the political parties. So the sovereign, well, it's difficult to not mention the sovereign, the political party itself. It's a political parties that the political parties was the result, not only normatively, it's of course started from the 19th century European political parties or the October Revolution in Russia. However, that political party was to some extent in the first half was the result of the so-called People's War, was a huge social mobilization, penetrated every corner of the society, each village and each unit. So that became the sovereign. So when we think about the contemporary China, for example, normatively speaking, before the 70s, China was not formal member of the UN. However, no countries cannot ignore China's sovereign state. That was one of the issues. Second, we can see that in 1969, there was a war between China and the Soviet Union as a sovereign conflict. But that war started from the political debates between the two parties. It started from the early 60s, continued gradually, became the conflicts between the two states, which also, that's why I think that we need to understand the political nature of the sovereignty, not only the normative form of the sovereignty in the sense. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, next, Wanjin, you have a question? Okay, please.
Yes, thank you, Professor, for the wonderful talk. It's always, I always feel excited to hear from you and to read your books and texts. This is not so much a question as a very stupid kind of observation. It seems to me that in this very productive presentation, you want to maneuver between on one hand, Marxist and Schmittian concepts and arguments, which are to some extent very general about some political concepts like revolution, like sovereignty, like the great transformation between the element of land to the element of sea in England and so on and so forth. On the other hand, the history of China, namely the way in which concretely and specifically China in different dynasties has to kind of translate from all these conceptual frameworks consciously or unconsciously several or a bunch of concepts and frameworks that give rise to what we call China as a nation state in modern times. This is a very difficult task, and I think you did a wonderful job. My impression is as follows. So this is, I'm not quite sure if I can put it clearly, but let me try. It seems to me that just like what Karl Marx did or said in the text 18th Brumaire, he says all these concepts we are using in order to describe what is happening in parliamentary democracy, all these concepts are inoperative. They cannot function well in representing the people, so that we have to invent something new, so that we see all these terrible performances happening in the realm of politics, right? By contrast, we need concepts like the proletariat, which is not a determined concept, which is exactly a concept that is performative in grasping what is happening in society. Mm-hmm. So, that is one thing. The thing is that when China in late 19th century and early 20th century translates all these political philosophical concepts, some via Japanese translation or directly from English or French, into China, and gave rise to a lot of discussions or disputes concerning what is a people, what is sovereignty, what is representation, what is democracy, what is constitutionalism, and so on and so forth. it seems to me that these concepts become something different. Of course, they are something different from what they originally were. What is important here is that, and this is actually from Hansier, they start to function independently in the particular sense in which these translated and borrowed terms start to be necessarily associated with a new political form, like the state of China after 1949, like the current China, which is still using these European political concepts, whereas whether the government or all these scholars are trying to give new significations to these European concepts. So my question is, or if not a question, then my stupid impression is that even though we have to historically, meticulously represent what really happened in the historical scenario in which China has a confrontation with the West, let's say, where all these European concepts were introduced into China, or borrowed by China, or imposed upon China. On the other hand, we have to insist upon them as if they were still effective, as if they were still kind of responsive to the current situation. And it reminds me of a lot of struggles concentrated upon concepts like, I don't know, democracy, like freedom of speech, like popular sovereignty, all these concepts which are highly problematic have to be reappropriated in order that they may function in another way in a politics to come, which according to Jacques Derrida, which is a state that is not constitutional, but has to be kept in mind every time we are confronted with legal systems, with political systems, with what we call democracy in reality, and so on and so forth. So what it seems to me that the difficulty lies in the dilemma that on one hand, we have to historically kind of deconstruct these seemingly neutral and kind of natural concepts, which are European, of course, on one hand. But on the other hand, we cannot do without them. We cannot simply say that, let's go back to Asian China. Let's reestablish all these political systems implemented in Qing Dynasty or in Ming Dynasty. No, we have to continue to use these European concepts and try to give them some new signification, which makes the very confrontation between China and Europe, let's say, in the present day, a far more difficult issue than what happened in early 20th century, let's say. That's my very superficial impression. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your comments. I agree with this because these concepts were, the 20th century, you can see that as one of the phenomena was a massive introduction of different concepts, reconstruction of the phenomena, let's say the live phenomenon. So it is a performative, maybe the performative concepts, you can argue that. And it depends on, because sometimes there were real the misuse and the mistakes, but it really depends on what kind of the politics you can invent it and create it in a long process of that. So with that, so that I think it's, I give one example. I often want to refer to the example. Liang Shuming was thought as the greatest Confucian thinker, and he paid so much attention, and he did a lot of the rural reform in some project in China. But he criticized the Communist Party's idea, especially the class and the class struggle. Basic argument was the first, class and the class struggle was the result of the industrialization in Europe. Since China was for so long an agricultural society, no so many so-called proletarian or even capitalists. We should rethink about the terms. So he preferred like literati and peasants and so on and so forth. However, after his visit to Yan'an and later he observed the rural reform in China, he was frustrated by the fact that he thought that the Communist Party used very alien concepts to mobilize the people, achieved results he himself really want to achieve, but he didn't. So on the one hand, in a descriptive level, his idea is more accurate. However, it's not that powerful for that, which means that it's not powerful enough to create the new politics. That's the real difference from here. So in that sense, we also need to rethink the role of the series of the debates since the end of 1920s, especially in the 1930s, on the nature of Chinese history, that the new framework, new categories, and new content, new concepts to use to describe the Chinese society that lead up the next stage of Chinese revolution. So that that's my comments again.
Thank you. It makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Wang Sensei, Professor Wang, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. It was really, really thought-inspiring, and it takes so much time to digest your historical, conceptual explanation. My question is very simple. Maybe I am a very simplistic believer of democracy, maybe, and I started this series of workshop because I am very interested in democracy. And my question is very simple. How can we put the concept of democracy into the conceptual and historical configuration you have just described? And let me explain a little bit my interest. My interest is a little bit close to that of Pierre Rosanvallon, who said that now in the actual world, the administrative power is becoming much more bigger, and people cannot take control of it. And so this is why, in a sense, democracy is now asking for sovereignty, right? So,
yes.
But at the same time, the concept of sovereignty is very problematic. And in listening to your wonderful conference, I had such an impression that the philosophers have tendency to talk about the concept of sovereignty, but it is very difficult to talk about that. But we still have this concept of sovereignty, and I have no idea which concept I can use instead of sovereignty in order to theorize democracy. So this workshop has begun with such interest, such a questioning. So this is a very simplistic question, but I will be very delighted if you answer the question.
Thank you for this question. I think it's a very important question, actually. Let me start it from your reference to the Rosanvallon, for example. Basic argument now, if you look at the current crisis of democracy, for me, it's not only the liberal democracy, but different political forms in the 20th century. I mean, different forms means that the first socialists, like Soviet, Eastern Asian, China, were after the 1989 that were collapsed. The first was the formal, the system collapsed. China was to some extent is different. That we can explain a little bit later. So the first crisis, second crisis together, I think these are linked together with liberal democracy. The liberal democracy, I think that for the, I think that for the Osman Hong was the breakdown between the political form and the social form, because you have no social form, substance, but you have the liberal democracy in the political form. Eventually, nobody were interested in that. For that's demonstrated the crisis of the current democracy in the West, let's say. Maybe it's also in Japan, also to some extent. But how to define the Chinese, especially when you talk about the sovereignty issue together with the democracy? My reaction, the first is that we need to rethink about the different concepts of democracies in the 20th century. Is a competitive. So in China, before the 1980, before the end of the Cold War, the term of democracy was very broadly used as a people's democracy or mass democracy, right? So the mass democracy or the people's democracy shaped historically in a long process, as I said, the People's War in China. Because after the 1911 revolution, the whole political system was really trying to use the Western liberal democratic form to introduce that form to China. You have the parliament, the multi-party system, election, and so on and so forth. The provincial system, and also the central governments, and all based on election and the parliament system, so that, and the political parties. However, the results of that was a warlords and the series of wars. We know the fragmentation of the China. That's the 1920s. That's the idea. Then you have the competition between the communists and the KMT as a unified party, national party, two national parties that fight each other. So that's the early. I think that the so-called the people's democracy, the category, emerged in the process. Of course, you have the European origin because who was the sovereign was the people, right? That's the idea. However, the people's democracy mainly came from the People's War. What's the invasion of that? For the political systems during the People's War, especially the war against the Japanese invasion at that time, because the first war, that was the first time since the 19th century, the late 19th century, the large-scale migration back to the countrysides. So the communists need to mobilize the peasants as a political subjects. So created several linkages. The first linkage is the party and the army, obviously. Before that, the political parties, national army should be neutralized. But the People's War, the army and the party closely linked together. Second, the party was linked together closely with the Soviet government. Means that the party and the state, of course, the state within the state is kind of the state, were linked together. Third, the party and the army should closely link together with the peasants' movements, because both party and the army was engaged in the land reform. Through the land reform, you can see that the certain kind of the organization where the party, the army, the state, and the different kind of the organization, peasants association, workers association, women's association, youth association were linked together. So that's why they are distinctively, they have the distinctive function, but in general, it's mobilized into one, so-called the people, the mass, in that long process. So in that case, were encouraged, they also absorbed some elements of the liberal democracy. For example, in the village level or different levels, they also vote. They have the different division of the powers within different levels. So, but in any case, they shape the political moments together with the organizational forms. That was so-called people's democracy. When after the end of the Cold War, the most of the people criticized because these kind of people's democracy was also in terms of the alienation, the self-alienation also changed, highly bureaucratization, the party, and that's the huge issue in the Cultural Revolution that we talk about. All these relations were fragmented. They said those bureaucratic was high officials was different from the masses, differentiated largely to that. So that's why even in the 1970s or the 1980s, at the beginning, the reflection on the Chinese political crisis with the Chinese political systems was still trying to appeal to the early history. I mean, these were still the intense interaction between that party, state, mass, and so on and so forth in the long process of Chinese Revolution or People's War. So there was an internal perspective to criticize the failure of the socialist democracy or dictatorship then. But after the end of the Cold War, such internal perspective gradually disappeared. The old idea, the whole democracy, the concept of the democracy became narrow and narrow into one form, which means that a liberal democracy. So in that sense, liberal democracy became the only perspective to criticize any kind of political systems. For example, we in the 80s, like my generation or the 90s, when we criticize our own systems, most of the starting point were liberal democracy. So that's why the political crisis now, when the liberal democracy in crisis described as Rosamahon, what's the imagination for the different forms of political forms, which can integrate the social form together in different ways? Because for the liberal democracy, they always imagine a certain liberal stage in history that integrated together. But the Chinese Revolution was also had such a same function for that. But after the end of the Cold War, these kind of the legacy completely forgotten. So that's why we could only thought that in that sense, we all agree with Francis Fukuyama's idea of end of history was the only form. So that's the issue. That's also why when I talk about, when you ask me to address about the sovereignty, I try to rethink about the different forms of the wars. Early wars, the national wars, defense wars. Another was the People's War. Means that a certain kind of the revolution which contained the new elements for the popular participation as a political subject. That was the substance of the so-called people's democracy in the history, in our own history. So that's why we can reflect, not necessarily go back to that history, but that provide an internal perspective to rethink the contemporary crisis of political systems. I mean, in that sense, it's not only for the Chinese political systems, but also provide the alternative perspective to rethink about the general crisis of political systems. So that's my idea.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's very touching remarks. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, 先生はどうでしょうね。
Okay, Chin, please. And
Okay.
Next, I will ask Maki to raise question. Before that, Chin, please, Chin, to say.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Wang, for your wonderful and informative talk. And I am particularly interested in your comment on two opium wars, the Xinhai Revolution, and of course these Ryukyu and Taiwan, Korea issues. But I'm not sure if in the case of Ryukyu, it will fit your framework, because you mentioned that these can be seen as maneuvers between continental forces and the new maritime forces. Of course, it happens in Macau, Hong Kong. These are the typical examples. But in the case of Ryukyu, I guess you may see Ryukyu is in connection with the Qing dynasty, so it's part of these continental forces. But I'm not sure if that could be the only way of reading the Ryukyu kingdoms, because they're supposed to be a kind of it's a pre-modern state, but at least it has its own kind of in modern day, in this contemporary times, kind of independence, if not sovereignty. So another quick question is on your ideas of sovereignty. So if I read correctly, I think in your paper you put the idea of territory as a kind of, if not sufficient, a kind of necessary condition of sovereignty. So these two concepts are really closely related to each other. But I'm not sure if that is the case, because in the case of, for example, in the even in medieval Europe, the sovereignty order of the sovereign order of Malta, for example, is actually one of these oldest institute of sovereignty, but it is still nowadays we still have this sovereignty order of Malta, but this sovereignty order has no territory. So it issues its own passport and it sends ambassadors to different countries, but it is so weird that it is a sovereignty without territory. So these kind of concepts could not be explained by these territorial conditions. So what should we approach the ideas of sovereignty in this sense? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your question. I started from the last question and back to the early question. And so first of all, when we talk about the sovereignty, you can argue that the early lord or they had the authority to dispatch some envoys and so on and so forth. But when we talk about the sovereignty was mainly in the context of the post-17th century, that when we talk about that. So that's why, especially the certain kind of the special forms of the state. And of course, when we talk about the people's sovereignty, you cannot argue the social political status, but still linked to the state. So that's why the territory issue became the integral to the new normative idea of the sovereignty. But But these were, that's why when we talk about the sovereignty, it's almost impossible not to talk about these kind of issues. So you can argue like when we discuss politically, when we talk about the people's state, we cannot not necessarily only talk about the territory, but still it's in the constitutional framework. Then you have to deal with these kind of the issues. So that's why I understand your idea, but in the current context, when we talk about sovereignty, I think it's inevitable to talk about these kind of the elements. As for about the Okinawa or the Liuqiu's issue, so your question is that whether or not it's a continental issue or the maritime issue, right? So this is also interesting, the issues. My arguments, it's first that if we try to deal with relations that the position of Liuqiu or the later Okinawa in the whole region is also very important, interesting, the case, because it's not only when I talk about the Tibet, the Xinjiang, and so on and so forth, it's not only within the territory of the Qing court, right? It's not necessarily as a territory, but a certain kind of network or the tributary relations in the whole region. And also even before the Western powers come in, it's already there. And between Japan and China, the Qing or the Ming and the Qing, and also Okinawa, these are regional relations. These are one aspect. It is the coastal relations. It is the maritime relations, but it's different from the Western maritime relations. Some concepts from my imagination, like in Taiwan, is also the islands. And you know that there was different categories and different ways for that. A lot of the political, the so-called administrative form came from inland. So it's a mountain area, the people in the mountain area or in other areas, certain kind of division was almost the same in the Yunnan and the Guizhou, the ways of it. So in that sense, it's a different form. It's not as significant as the 19th century when the Carl Schmitt described the distinction between the continental and the maritime, because he tried to study from the normative perspective to see different orders, completely different orders. In that sense, the confrontation, because when the Japan tried to, let's say the attack the Liuqiu the first and the Taiwan the second, actually Taiwan, that the negotiation between Japan and the Qing court was in Japanese sides tried to use the European international law. The definition about the inside and outside came from the European idea. But here in China, in the Qing court, was still trying to talk about the Yi and the Xia and so on and so forth. So that's in that sense, it's a two kind of the conflicts, extension of the conflicts of the two orders. So in that sense, Japan more or less adopt more like a maritime order. So the Qing court continue to use that order from the continental stretched into the sea. So you can see these kind of the relationship.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah.
A great discussions. So we are now opening our discussion to our audiences. And I noticed that the Professor Sato Maki has been raising hand for a long time. So please, Maki-san, please raise your question.
Professor Wang, thank you very much for your wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. And I had a chance to read through Professor Zishi's translated version of your The Rise of Modern Chinese Thought which you published in 2008. And I really enjoyed reading that. And I was really looking forward to listening to your lecture today. And thank you so much. But my question is, today, you just briefly mentioned about it. Sorry, my light is like, no, it's here, sorry. So you briefly mentioned about how the technology plays a role during the early 19th century to the late 19th century. You mentioned about how the measurement technology has changed and how the borders came into place and how the Gregorian time has changed the Chinese notion of chronological concept, right? And I see Professor Hui is here, so I'm a little bit afraid about, because I know that he has written the question concerning technology in China. So I'm a little bit afraid of my stupid question, but I would like to ask Professor Wang on the role of the technology and how the technology or the current technology might change the future sovereignty in that sense. Because when I talk with students from Peking University, they keep on saying to me that the current technology has been changing a lot and is working quite well in China, mainly mainland China, especially when they talk about COVID-19 situation. They say that the technology is playing a great role in Chinese sovereignty. And I'm really conscious about what these new technology might bring us, bring the sovereignty, the huge change in the near future. And at the same time, I'm also I don't know, it's like Joron, so I'm not really sure which chapter I cannot tell you the chapter, but in your the rise of modern Chinese thought, you mentioned about depoliticization and devalue of the sovereignty by using magicking. You used the word magic, but you said that science and technology might unmagic this sovereignty, and might be that that depoliticization and devaluation of the sovereignty might work by using this science and technology. You didn't really mention what actually you mean by science and technology, but at the same time, I would also like to know what you actually meant by it, because we are now in 2021, and this was written in 2008. So I'm quite sure that you have been, following all these changes, and I'm really passionate about listening to your current idea. So that is my humble question.
Sure. Thank you very much. Though I'm a layman in the natural science, though actually the last volume of my book, that the rise of modern Chinese thought, was devoted to the question of science in China. The last, not only for technology, but everything, so many things, because our views about the cosmos, nature, and ourselves reshaped in the 20th century, mainly because of the science and technology. So that's the why. It's very important. I give you let's give the historical sense. When I talk near-Jing spirituality, that they invited not only the mission Jesuits from the Portuguese and France, but also especially the cartography for delineate the borders between Russia and China. So which means that they need something objective, the creation of objectivity for the recognition from both sides. So it's not for me, the objectivity itself is needed by the certain kind of the recognition and the mutual negotiation. But then you find a technology intervention into the affairs on the border issue, so-called a sovereign issue, and so on and so forth. Sovereign issue have never been the real objective, but they always try to show that the objectivity as an objectivity issue, like the borders, and so that's absolutely related to the technology issue. Now, we talk about currently, we know that these days, so much people talk about the meta. So it is another world. When we talk about for example, the Carl Schmitt and the Kojève, after the World War II, they began to discuss about the so-called spatial revolution. Means that now it's the Earth as a village. These are kind of the 20th century story. And now we are in the new context of the spatial revolutions. At least two kind of the spatial revolutions. First was like a meta, is a digital spatial revolutions. So digital spatial revolution was so important. And I think but on the other hand, these kind of spatial revolution happened in the process of more, to some extent, similar to the spatial revolution after the 16th century. Because the so-called maritime, we know that the international order, that is so-called international law, deeply influenced by the sea law in the early days. So who were the major powers to shape the international order? It was nation states. It was pirates. It was big companies. So different forces eventually shaped the idea of the sovereign rights. So it's not only no such international family, it's just to fight each other, but pirates fight with the states, state fight with states, and the big companies also involving, and also different peoples. And now, the digital order, it's chaotic. It's like the anarchy situation. It's almost like a colonial time at that time. Who will decide the order? Now, nation state, one. It's hackers, the second. Obviously, so many people, if I find that it's like Assange and so different, some more positive political activists in the digital space, and also some commercial activists, and some other, the anarchy revolutionary, you can describe them as hacker pirates within the digital ideas, and also the consumers together. So you can see eventually these spatial revolution will reshape the orders, and some basic units transformed. I think this is the one very different from before. When we talk about, for example, digital personalities, because we can invent the different personalities in different digital forms and play the role for a long time. It's how can describe these people, individual, the citizen, or so on and so forth in this space. And obviously, when we talk about democracy in this revolution, or the sovereignty in this revolution, which is radically different from before, which not necessary to say these were the state disappeared. No, state is still there, but state only the one player in these spatial for the ways. These are second, I think it's still in a changing. The third one, I think it's not only the meta in the digital level, but also we know that in the really cosmos, now the landing project in not only the moon, Mars, and some others, and a lot of the new things, it's just the beginning. but we don't know that also reshaped the human being and reshaped the earth, that the role of the earth. And the earth as a community should be something outside. Otherwise, how can you define yourself as a community? So in that sense, the human community, maybe it's also related to these two, the new spatial revolutions. Obviously, at that time, the idea of sovereignty will change so much, radically transformed. So that's in a changing system. So in this case, we are in the process of radical transformations, but still, as we have no such political orders in the global level, but it's also no idea is still in either digital nor the cosmos. It's in a universal level. We talk about this like in a 16th century down to the 19th century or the 20th century, the so-called international order was still not that clear. So, and also maybe Carl Schmitt in 1929, he published a paper on the depoliticization and neutralization. So one of the key words was a neutralization. He thought that the whole political system was shaped by the technology. And eventually the governance or these kind of management replaced the political. So in that sense, the depoliticization was along with this long process. But now we can see was the result of the depoliticization. It's as Professor Koshiro Kobugon said that we talk about the Rosenwald Holmes description of the crisis of the democracy was one of the phenomena of depoliticization in the Western liberal democracy. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Wang.
Anyone else?
じゃあ、会場の皆さんに。
Yeah, any question from floors?
If not, so I guess that we are in a, because you said after during your response to Professor Kokubun Koichiro, you said that democracy is also different forms of war that leads to revolution. So what I thought from your response now to my question, I thought that this could be, a new form of new war, new type of war that could happen. And this is very interesting because it's like destruction, but at the construction at the same time. So war could be a destruction, but then at the same time, it could bring out new things, right? So in this universe, in this digital personalities and cosmos, you mentioned about Mars and Moon, that the people are now starting to, explore. I wonder if Earth is going to be the other to us, then, and it is already the Mother Earth is the other to us, which you mentioned in your The Rise of Modern Chinese Thought. You made like a dichotomy between human and nature, natural and the technology, the artificial. And so I thought that it could also, bring up new dimension to the war in terms of democracy. What is your way to take on this new type of, digital personalization or digital sovereign, or, inclusive of this new exploitation to some other star like Mars and, Moon or Pluto or wherever.
I mean, because I still, let's start from the history, then to the Mars and the moons. It's more difficult for me to think about that. But in any case, in my paper, in the end of my paper, actually I showed that because you talk about the wars, what I try to say that the difference between the wars. I said that in the 20th century, that the war were closely linked together with the revolutions, means that the war itself is a long process of politicization. So without that's like a land reform, the peasants became the new political subjects and so on and so forth. That was the war and the revolution at that time. Of course, still all the wars and the revolutions had a lot of the let's say the tragedies happening within the sacrifice and so on and so forth. So that's the issue. But what I can say that in that long process, generate some new political, But now it's difficult to say. It's really, I don't see what's the new political can generate from the wars, any kind of the form of wars, because it's heavily depends on the technology now. So that's the real issue. So in the People's War, the core idea of the People's War, it was that the human being was the decisive role in the war. But you look at all the discussions about the war currently, it's about technology. It's not about the human being. It's not about the generation of new political subjectivity of the human being. So in that sense, now the war itself is completely depoliticized. In that sense, whether or not it still can generate a new political, I don't know. I don't see that. That's why the idea of the People's War in the 20th century, it was a crucial concept of political concept. It's not only the descriptive concept. It's not only descriptive about the war, description about the war. It was a kind of political concept which generated a new political subjectivity. But if the war now mainly decided by the technology, everything, it did transformed. So the core of the idea of People's War fundamentally transformed. So that's, I think we're still, in that sense, we're still living in the age of depoliticization. And another, maybe I add one comment about the sovereignty issue. Because the whole sovereignty, normatively speaking, linked together with the state framework. Without state, it's as the Wang Qing and some other, they all talk about that. However, the sovereignty in the 20th century is not only linked to the state, because it's a political concept can link together with the people, the party, and some others, which in the process of shaping the new political subjects. So in that sense, yeah, we claim ourselves, the people claim ourselves as a sovereign subject. So in that sense, the 20th century China itself had a lot of the experience of, I'm not talking about it's not necessarily I try to say that everything was nice. It's so many problems. However, some lessons is that how in such a society, Chinese process in the 20th century can generate the new politics and a new political subjectivity in the whole process. Cultural revolution, I mean, not only the Cultural Revolution, but I say that from later Qing, May 4th movement, 30s, 40s, that created a lot of the new subjects. And the People's War was also shaped a new subjects, generate a new subjectivity. So when you ask about the current the role of the technology is obviously transformed so much. It's a really play. But now it's like a COVID-19, the organization of the state and a lot of the policies linked together, like a cell phone and 健康码 in Chinese, were really effective. But it's still basically is really related to the state framework. So in that sense, reaffirm the sovereignty is different from other. In the 20th century, in that sense, it's a little bit different. I try to still argue that. That's why I'm trying to rethink the 20th century, because that was the age of the politicization.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Professor Kokubun is asking students to raise some questions. Maybe you can raise question in your convenient language, even in Japanese or Chinese.
Undergraduate students. そうだからせっかく来てるからなんかすごく簡単なんでちょこっと聞いたりしてみませんか。こんないい機会はないんですよ。先生になんかすごく簡単な質問とかでもいいですけどどうですか。なかなか難しいですか。ちょっとやってみようかな。終わっちゃいますので。よし、来た。
Okay, please, Tomoko Takahashi.
Yes, well, thank you very much for the opportunity for me to ask questions. I'm a student, a doctoral student here at the University of Tokyo, studying international relations. So honestly, I really need to study a lot more to ask you a question. So I'm afraid of asking my question. But personally, I'm interested in the relation between China's sovereignty vis-a-vis international institutions, namely the United Nations. And I'm working on the project right now. And so especially in the 20th century, I think China, for example, Wellington coup went to the League of Nations and had a lot of things to do with sovereignty. So I was kind of willing to ask your opinions on the relation between international institutions and sovereignty in particular, because I think in history, people say that they envision China as one state within the League of Nations, regardless of which sects are actually feeding into diplomacy back then. So I know it was a very fluid time, but I'm willing to learn your opinions. Thank you very much.
So can you a little bit add some explain your the real question that I'm sorry I'm not. You mean that in the 20th century, what's the role of Chinese? What's the state of Chinese performance in international relations?
So I think I'm personally interested in how global constitutionalism can mean for the state. And of course, 20th century and current politics are so different, but I'm willing to learn your opinions on this matter.
Okay, thank you. I'm not the specialist in the field of international relations, but I just tried my best to answer your question. First of all, China, even before the 1971, that China was, the People's Republic of China was not recognized as a member of UN. At that time, Taiwan was continued after the end of the Civil War. You know the story. But as I said, that even though China was still recognized broadly as a sovereign state, independent state, I think it's not possible not ignore the sovereign existence of China at that time. There was a huge difference, I think, between the 70s, either before the 70s and after the 70s, partly because before the 70s, China, especially the 60s, were still mainly the ally of Eastern European bloc, the UN lead. and also trying to carry out the policy to support the third order revolutions. So that's the basic framework. But after the 70s, I think gradually China transformed the way, and now became the member of UN, and China after the establishment is eager into, but only after the beginning of the 70s accepted by UN as the formal member of that. So afterwards, China became quite active, I think, in different institutions. Several changes, like a peacekeeping process. Before that, China had the policy not allow the Chinese soldiers out of the territory, right? But gradually, China involved in the peacekeeping process and so on and so forth. So that's the big change. And different other organizations. It's a huge, long process. Now more, I think, is a more and more. But from our perspective, like from Chinese perspective, partly because of it's still is a new man in that the organizations is still not so much how those, including China, not only basically those institutions that were organized by the Western countries, and a lot of the systems were there. How made these kind of the systems more like more democratic, or and how the China can engage more? That's still the big issue. These are kind of the, let's say, it's still very active, but I don't know. It's for me, we still not so many, let's say, the real professional figures who really serve this, can really for this duty and service. So that's why, partly because of the language issue before. We know that a lot before, most of the diplomats in China were trained in the foreign language, the fields, but now it's trying to change, and in different social science and some other fields, which also partly because you need the professional knowledge to enter into these kind of institutions. But these are, honestly, I'm not the specialist in these. I'm very, maybe it's a too superficial answers for you. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, wonderful discussion. Actually, yeah, because I am a moderator today, so I didn't raise my question. But if Professor Kokubun allows me to ask question, I want to, yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, actually, I would like to express some sort of anxiety in recent years. Yeah, and in today's talk, your talk, you didn't mention the Lu Xun's thought of the resistance to disappear. But I think this is your starting point as a researcher, not only for today's discussion. It's a very important and very impressive notion. And I think that such a kind of position where Lu Xun stood is also a position of the people stand on, okay? But when we are talking about the People's Revolution, especially, we remember the notion of people's war under the COVID pandemic. So, yeah, I'm a little bit afraid that how can we overcome Schmittian sense of friend-enemy dichotomy when we're still speaking about on the people's war model for imagining the people. Can you, yeah, is it able to imagine other kind of people without the enemy?
COVID-19, I think that when they talk about, if you talk about the enemy, obviously they try to project the COVID-19 as an enemy rather than the other people. I think that's why the war against the COVID-19, the spreading of, at least the spreading of the COVID-19. So this is the first comment. And also in my early work, the last year I published a short paper for Lenin's, the anniversary of the 140 years, which raised a lot of the debates on that. But one distortion and the misuse of my concept was that exactly about the People's War. I said that the People's War, in the 20th century, People's War was a long process in which the new political subjectivity generated. But I didn't see the new political subjectivity emerged in the whole process of the war against the COVID-19. That basically it is administration, it is technology, and it is somewhere still, in that sense, the subjectivity of the people didn't generate it. In that sense, this is not in the sense of the People's War in the 20th century. So I clearly say that about this. But people, it's easy to use that term, because especially in the mass media, they use that together. As I also say, that the second point is that the general war and the People's War was in opposite position in the 20th century. Because the general war was mobilized, it's a national, it's really only the national. It's like a Schmittian idea. It was a general war for the mobilization, mainly the only subject was the state. So, but the People's War is different. As I said, that the women, youth, kids, or the peasants, or different people became the political subjects. So that's the People's War. So it's also the massive mobilization, but it's different from that. That's the issue, whether or not the political was only bound with the framework of the state. For me, I can see clearly in the 20th century that the state is a long process at that time, was still before the independence, for example. But on the other hand, you can find different forms. So political was not only linked to the state, like Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt was only the nation, was the last, the concept. So in that sense, when I talk about the People's War, I try to rethink about the process and alternative to generate new political subjectivity, which obviously it's not. It's because more like the general war, not like People's War in this case. So, but of course, you can find a lot of the elements came from the People's War. Because even in China, the local mobilization and a different organization were from below. That was the result of the People's War in the new context.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe this question is related to the Zhang thought of the equalization of all things. So I would like to discuss with you in the near future. Thank you very much. So I'm sorry, but I have to say we are running out of time. So I would like to ask Professor Kokubun to give closing remarks.
Okay. Thank you again for your wonderful talk, Professor Wang. I think I myself, I could deepen what I had thought of the concept of sovereignty. And personally, it was a great pleasure and to feel your generous personality. I'm very happy. So thank you. Yeah, it was a great honor to have you as an invited speaker to this workshop. Thank you so much. Please give a round of applause for Professor Wang's great conference. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Very
much.
much.
Thank you. Okay. Okay. So see you. Goodbye.
See you again in Beijing.
Merci. ありがとうございました。Thank you.
Thank you.